How do you know when someone's mind is starting to slip? Not when they're screaming. Not when they're throwing punches. Not when they're causing trouble. The people who work inside jails will tell you it usually starts much smaller than that. A change in routine. A change in behavior. A man who suddenly isn't acting like himself anymore. The strange thing is that the person going through it often doesn't realize it's happening. Everyone else does, but not him. So here's the question. What happens when a man who built his entire identity around attention suddenly finds himself trapped in a place where nobody cares who he is? No audience, no live stream, no followers, no spotlight, just walls, hours, silence, and his own thoughts, over and over again. Because according to disturbing new details emerging from inside the jail in June 2026, prison guards are reported witnessing behavior from Chud the Builder that has people asking a question few thought they'd ever ask. Is he losing control behind bars? The answer isn't as simple as most people think. Because what makes this story so disturbing isn't just what's happening inside that jail. It's what happens when you compare the man prison staff are allegedly seeing today to the man millions of people thought they knew before he was locked up. The difference is shocking. And once you hear what guards have reportedly been observing, you'll understand why some people believe the real punishment isn't the cell. It's what the cell may be doing to his mind. Most channels are talking about the charges. Others are talking about the court case. But they're missing the story unfolding behind those walls right now. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the most disturbing development in this entire case may have nothing to do with a courtroom at all. If you're here because you want the real version of cases like this, the kind of deep walkthrough that doesn't stop at the thumbnail and actually follows the timeline into the uncomfortable places, take 5 seconds right now and subscribe to Crime and Order. Hit the notification bell while you're there, because this case is not finished. It is still moving through the courts as you watch this, and when the next ruling drops, that bell is the only way you won't miss what happens next. In June 2026, a man named Dalton Eatherly is sitting inside a Tennessee jail. To the people who know his face, and there are a great many of them, he is not Dalton Eatherly. He is Chud the Builder, a live streamer with an audience built on confrontation, on provocation, on a willingness to say the things other people won't. That he is now behind bars is, on its own, not the strange part of this story. He is facing charges serious enough that, if a jury convicts him, he could lose decades of his life to a prison cell. The strange part is a single sheet of paper, an order, signed by a judge, that does something the bars alone could never do. It does not add a single day to a sentence, because there is no sentence yet. Instead, it reaches past the cell, past the locked door, and switches off the one thing this man was actually made of. It legally forbids him from speaking about the only story that matters to him in the entire world, his own. No live stream, no interview, no post unpacking the case for the audience that built him. The most online man in Clarksville, Tennessee, a man whose reflex in any conflict was to broadcast it, ordered into silence on the single subject every one of his followers is waiting to hear about. And so a question rises out of this case that almost no one covering it has stopped to ask. It is not the question of whether he did it. The courts will answer that one. It is a stranger question, and the longer you hold it, the heavier it gets. For a man like Dalton Eatherly, which is the real cage, the jail he is sitting in, or the silence he was sentenced to inside it? Because once you understand who this man was before that order, what he built, what it was made of, and how fast it all came apart on a single Wednesday afternoon outside a courthouse, you may begin to see why some people believe the gag order is the part of this he can least afford to survive. And the facts behind it are far stranger than the headlines ever made them sound. Now, back to Dalton Eatherly. And to understand the silence, you first have to understand the noise. Chud the Builder was not an accident. It was a brand, a character, a product with a market. Dalton Eatherly, 28 years old, did not stumble into a following. He built one, deliberately, on the architecture of modern internet attention. By being loud, by being confrontational, by live streaming the kind of material that travels fast because it makes people furious. National outlets, including CNN, would later describe him plainly as a creator known for posting racist content. That was not a footnote to the persona. It was the persona. The provocation was the engine. The outrage was the fuel. The audience came for the friction. And Eatherly learned, the way every creator in that corner of the internet learns, that conflict is the most valuable raw material there is, as long as you point a camera at it. Hold on to that instinct. Memorize it, because it is the thread that runs through everything that follows, all the way to the order that took his voice. This was a man whose deepest reflex, when the world pushed against him, was to broadcast the push. A court document would eventually put that reflex into cold, official language. It referenced Eatherly's significant social media presence. It noted his documented history of live streaming and of publicly commenting on legal matters and confrontations. Read that twice. A court, an institution that deals in restraint and procedure and silence, looked at this man and saw someone whose habit was to turn the legal system itself into content. That observation will matter enormously by the end of this story. For now, just understand the shape of the man. The conflict was the show, and the show was the life. The trouble did not begin at the courthouse. It had already started. Earlier in that same month of May 2026, in Nashville, Eatherly had been arrested. The charges were the everyday kind that orbit a person living loud and reckless, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and theft. Call that the warm-up, a signal flare. A man whose collisions with the world were getting harder and closer together. And then came Wednesday, May 13th, 2026. The day the noise stopped being a brand and became something that put two men on the ground. Here is the detail that makes it land. The one that should sit wrong in your chest. The reason Eatherly was at the courthouse that day was not dramatic. It was almost embarrassingly small. He had a court appearance, scheduled over an alleged debt. Somewhere around $3,000 owed to a credit company. That is the entire premise. Not a feud. Not a vendetta. A man with a money problem, walking into the Montgomery County Courthouse in Clarksville, Tennessee, on an ordinary afternoon, in a public plaza where other people were going about the most ordinary business of their lives. And in that plaza, Dalton Eatherly crossed paths with a man named Joshua Fox. Remember that name. Burn it in. Because the loudest corners of the internet have spent this entire story looking at the streamer, and Joshua Fox is the man at the actual center of it. The man who never asked to be in anyone's content, who walked into that courthouse for his own quiet reason, and walked out fighting for his life. Fox had a hearing of his own that day, a child support hearing. He was 31 years old. By the accounts of the people who know him, he was a disabled veteran. He was a father of 3 children. He was not a character in anyone's show. He was a man with a life and a family, and a reason to be standing exactly where he was standing. Picture the geometry of it for a moment, because the geometry is part of the horror. A public plaza on a weekday, a government building. The kind of place where the worst thing that is supposed to happen is a long line and a parking ticket. People moving through it on their own small errands. Appointments, hearings, paperwork, the slow machinery of ordinary lives intersecting with the law. Into that space walks a man whose whole life is a broadcast. And across that space stands a father here to talk about his children. 2 trajectories that should never have collided. And then, in the span of a single held breath, they did. What happened between the 2 men took seconds. Seconds. According to the arrest warrant, it began as a verbal dispute, words in a public plaza, between 2 strangers. And then, prosecutors say, the encounter turned. Investigators described Etherly turning his body into what they called a bladed stance, a term that means turning side on, squaring up, the posture a person takes in the half-second before committing to something physical. And in that posture, the warrant states, Etherly reached for a firearm in his jacket pocket. A physical altercation followed. And during that struggle, prosecutors say, Etherly fired. Not once. Joshua Fox was struck multiple times, in the torso and in the arm. When investigators processed the scene, they recovered 7 shell casings, and they would later establish that all 7 came from the same gun. And in the chaos of those few seconds, something else happened that tells you how fast and how close it all was. Etherly wounded himself too. He apparently shot himself in the arm. A paramedic reached Fox in the aftermath, and she would later testify about what she found. She said Fox was alert when she got to him, conscious, present, but she saw no exit wounds, and his blood pressure was dropping. To a trained responder, those two facts together mean one thing: internal bleeding, the kind that kills quietly, from the inside, while the person is still talking to you. Fox's own mother would later say what the doctors and nurses told the family. They had not expected her son to survive. 2 men down outside a courthouse, in the middle of an afternoon, in front of witnesses, over a story that started with a $3,000 debt. One of them a streamer whose whole life was performance. The other a father of 3 who had come to talk about supporting his kids. That is the scene, but a scene is not yet a case. Because before the gag order, before the Bond drama, before any of the strangeness that makes this story what it is, there was a far simpler question waiting to be answered. What actually happened in those seconds? And the moment investigators tried to answer it, the streamer's version of events and the evidence in front of them began to pull apart. Dalton Etherly had an explanation. He always had an explanation. Explaining himself to an audience was the thing he did best. But this time, the audience was a courtroom, and the explanation did not match what the evidence showed. Etherly claimed self-defense, and he was specific about it. He said that what he reached for in that moment was not a gun at all. It was mace, a defensive spray, the story of a frightened man protecting himself from a threat, not a man drawing a weapon on a stranger in a public square. It was a clean story. It was the kind of story a man who talks for a living knows how to tell. Simple, sympathetic, easy to repeat. It had only one problem, and then it had 2, and then it had 3. And one by one, the way they surfaced, they did not just weaken his account, they inverted it. The first problem was the camera. The plaza outside the courthouse was under surveillance, and the encounter was captured on video. No audio, but a clear view of what the bodies did. And when investigators testified about what that footage showed, they did not describe a man fumbling for a can of mace in fear. They described a man drawing a firearm. The second problem was the mace itself. If Etherly had reached for a defensive spray, there should have been a defensive spray. So investigators went looking for it. They searched the scene. They searched his truck. They searched his home. And the canister that would have backed up his entire account was nowhere. No mace at the plaza. No mace in the truck. No mace in the house. The object at the center of his story did not appear to exist. And the third problem, the one that changed the temperature of the whole investigation, was everything else they found when they went through his life. Because when detectives searched Dalton Etherly's truck and his home, they did not simply find the absence of mace. They found things that did not fit the portrait of an ordinary man who'd gone to court over a small debt and gotten unlucky in an argument. They found a bulletproof vest. They found a rifle. They found a shotgun. They found ammunition. They found a suspected bag of marijuana. And they found one item that did not belong in any innocent version of this story at all. An airline ticket to Istanbul, Turkey. Dated for a departure just days away, for the 22nd of May, barely more than a week after the shooting. Hold that image, and hold it tight, because the prosecution would hold it too. Body armor, a small arsenal, and a ticket out of the country, to a destination an ocean away, scheduled for the days right after a courthouse plaza filled with bystanders erupted in gunfire. Whatever that combination means, and a court will decide what it means, it was not the picture of a man who had simply panicked and reached for mace. And this is the moment to say the thing that has to be said clearly, before the narration carries you any further. None of this is a verdict. A warrant is an accusation, not a finding. Surveillance footage is evidence to be argued over, not a confession. A man is allowed to be armed, allowed to own body armor, allowed to buy a plane ticket. And Dalton Eatherly is presumed innocent of every charge against him until and unless a jury says otherwise. That presumption is not a technicality this story is obligated to recite. It is the floor the entire thing stands on. Keep it in mind, because the case is about to get loud enough to drown it out. Eatherly was arrested. He was hospitalized for the wound to his own arm, and within days, still injured, he was brought before a judge to answer for a stack of charges that read like a wall closing in: attempted murder, employing a firearm during the commission of a dangerous felony, aggravated assault, and reckless endangerment with a deadly weapon. At his arraignment, General Sessions Court Judge H. Reed Poland, the third set bond, and he set it high, $1.25 million. The judge was explicit about why. He pointed to how many people had been standing in that public courtyard when the shots were fired, and to the sheer seriousness of the felonies stacked against the defendant. This was not, in the court's eyes, a quiet dispute. It was gunfire in a crowd. Eatherly, sitting there in a jail jumpsuit, reportedly closed his eyes when he heard the number. And it is right here, at the bond, at the number, at the closed eyes, that this case stops being a story about a shooting and starts becoming something far stranger. Because Dalton Eatherly was not an ordinary defendant facing an impossible bond alone. He had something most defendants in a Tennessee jail do not have. He had a crowd, an audience, hundreds of thousands of people who knew his face, some fraction of whom were ready, willing, and organized to do the one thing that could pull him back out into the daylight: pay. And a court system that had taken one long look at Chud the Builder was about to do something very deliberate and very unusual, to make sure that crowd could not simply buy his freedom. And then, days later, to do something that no amount of money could undo at all. What that court did to the money. The single sentence a judge said to Eatherly's own attorney in open court. A sentence that exposes exactly how the legal system now sees a man who turned himself into a username. The words Joshua Fox's mother chose to say while the internet screamed around her. And the order that finally took from Dalton Eatherly the one thing the bars never could: his voice. If you want to see how a performer gets sentenced to silence before a jury has heard a single word, subscribe to Crime and Order right now and hit that like button. Because this story did not end with an arrest. It is still being written, one ruling at a time. For most men in a cell, the worst hours are the empty ones. For Dalton Eatherly, the empty hours were never the problem. He always had somewhere to put them, because for a man who built his life out of live streams, the feed was never just a job. It was the room he lived in. It was the place where time moved differently, where he wasn't a defendant with a docket number, he was a performer with an audience, and the audience was always there, always watching, always one tap away. When the rest of the world closed in, that was the space he could open up. A camera, a microphone, a crowd that came running the moment he went live. That was his recreation yard, not a patch of concrete behind a wall. A signal going out to hundreds of thousands of people who knew his face. And in June 2026, the law took that yard away from him on purpose. Not the cell, the yard. It found the one space where Dalton Eatherly's time still moved, and it shut the door. Here is how it happened, and why the closing of that door may be the single most consequential thing that has happened to him since the shooting itself. Dalton Eatherly was never going to face his bond the way an ordinary defendant does, alone, at the mercy of a number he could not reach. He had something almost no one in a Tennessee jail has. He had a crowd. Long before the courthouse, back when he was building the brand, Eatherly had launched a crowdfunding campaign on the platform Give, Send, Go. By the time the shots were fired outside the Montgomery County Courthouse, that campaign had pulled in more than $270,000. Think about what that represents. Not just money, infrastructure, an audience already organized, already opening its wallet, already trained to show up when Chud the Builder asked. For most defendants, a high bond is a wall. For Eatherly, it looked, at first, like a wall with a crowd on the other side ready to tear it down. The court saw that crowd coming, and it moved, deliberately, to cut it off. First, the number itself moved. The bond that General Sessions Judge H. Reed Poland III had originally set at $1.25 million was reset to $1 million. On paper, a break for the defense. But it came tethered to a ruling that mattered far more than the $150,000 difference. A judge ruled that Eatherly could not use any of the money raised through crowdfunding after the 13th of May, the day of the shooting, to pay that bond. In one stroke, the engine that had powered his entire public life was walled off from the one thing he now needed it for. The story had generated a fortune. The court said the fortune the story generated could not buy him out. And then, in early June, a second judge took it further. Stop and notice what the court was actually doing across these rulings, because it is unusual enough to be worth naming. Bond is not supposed to be a punishment. In principle, it is a guarantee, a financial promise that a defendant will come back to court. But here was a defendant who, the prosecution had argued, owned body armor and had bought a ticket out of the country for the days right after the shooting. A defendant whose entire livelihood and a $250,000 war chest lived online and could move anywhere he could carry a phone. Read in that light. Every ruling that followed reads less like routine bookkeeping and more like a court methodically removing the exits, one at a time. Circuit Court Judge William Goodman III maintained the $1 million bail and stacked it with conditions engineered, almost surgically, to make it nearly impossible to post. Normally, a $1 million bond runs through a bonding company, pay the fee. The company guarantees the rest. You walk. Goodman cut the legs out from under that math. He capped how much liability any single bonding company would be permitted to take on in Eatherly's case at $100,000. Run the arithmetic, and the trap becomes clear. To cover a $1 million bond, when no company can shoulder more than 100,000 of it, you would need 10 separate bonding companies to line up and split the risk. In court, the defense pushed against it. A friend of Eatherly's had stepped forward, willing to put up money. Eatherly's attorney told the judge that only 2 bonding companies were even willing to touch the case, and asked him to raise the cap so the thing could actually be done. Goodman said no, and then, almost as an afterthought, he added one more condition for the unlikely event that Eatherly did get out: a curfew. Home every single night, from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. But it was not the cap, or the curfew, or the math that became the line this whole case turns on. It was a question the judge asked out loud. A question that, once you hear it, tells you everything about how the legal system had come to see the man standing in front of it. Judge Goodman looked at the defendant, at a man whose entire identity was a username, and he could not seem to locate the actual person underneath it. So he asked, "Does he do anything other than social media?" And then, almost in disbelief, the line itself. "Is Chud the Builder? Am I to assume he does any kind of construction work?" Sit with that for a second. A sitting judge in open court, holding a man's freedom in his hands, had to ask whether the builder actually builds anything. The brand had become so total, so all-consuming, that the court could not find a profession, a routine, a real-world anchor beneath it. And the answer did not come from Etherly, who by then was already being pushed toward silence. It came from his own attorney, defending him, and it may be the most quietly devastating sentence in the entire case. Yes, the lawyer conceded. His client did technically have a construction company. But, in the lawyer's own words about his own client, I believe most of his focus nowadays are on his online presence. There it is, the whole man, summarized by the one person paid to defend him. The building was the costume. The online presence was the life, which is exactly what makes the next piece of paper land the way it does. On the same day Etherly's case was formally bound over to a grand jury and elevated from General Sessions Court up to Circuit Court, a judge signed an order. It did not add a year to a sentence. There is no sentence, because there has been no trial. It did something more precise, and, in its way, more total. The order prohibits Dalton Etherly from making public statements about the facts of the case, through social media posts, through live streams, through interviews. The filing did not dance around why. It cited his significant social media presence directly. It pointed to his history of live streaming and of publicly commenting on legal matters and on his own confrontations. Violating it could open him to contempt of court proceedings. The order was not absolute. The judge left one narrow lane open. Etherly is still permitted to make general statements asserting his innocence, and to discuss what is already part of the public record. But the heart of it, the actual story, the blow-by-blow only he can give, the content his entire audience is sitting there waiting for, that is sealed. For most defendants, a gag order is an inconvenience laid over a life that was already mostly private. For this defendant, it is something else entirely. The court did not restrict the edges of Dalton Etherly's life. It reached into the center of it and switched off the machine he was made of, and noticed the precision of it. The order did not try to silence him completely. It could not, and it did not pretend to. He may still say, to anyone who will listen, that he is innocent. He may still point at the public record. What he may not do is the one specific thing his whole career was built on. Take the rawest, most charged conflict of his life and turn it, live, into a story for a watching crowd. The court left him the right to protest his innocence and took away the only medium through which he ever knew how to do it. That is not a blunt instrument. That is a scalpel, and it found the exact nerve. And this is the idea at the bottom of the whole case, the one that deserves to be said slowly and said carefully, because it is an argument about irony, not a claim about guilt. The jail can hold his body. That part is ordinary. Men survive cells. The cell was always the expected price. But the gag order reaches the part of him the bars cannot touch. The performer, the provoker, the man whose deepest reflex, in any moment of conflict in his entire adult life, was to point a camera at it and talk. The system did not just take his freedom. It found the one punishment that lands hardest on a person built like this one, the loss of voice, and it imposed that before a single juror has been seated. Run it back through everything you now know, and the symmetry is almost unbearable. Here is a man who turned every collision of his life into content, who built a fortune and a following on the act of narrating his own confrontations to a watching crowd. And he has finally walked into the one confrontation, the most consequential of his life, the one his audience most wants to hear, that he is legally forbidden to narrate. The performer who can't perform. That is the engine of this story, and it is the reason it sits so strangely. Not because Dalton Etherly deserves your sympathy. The courts will sort out what he deserves. but because the shape of his punishment is so precisely matched to the shape of who he made himself into. He spent years building a life where his voice was everything, and the law, without raising its own voice at all, simply turned it off. If this case has its hooks in you, if you're sitting there turning that over, drop your city in the comments right now. Let's see where this one is landing, and who's actually here for it. Every comment builds this place into something real. A room full of people working through the same strange story at the same time, from opposite ends of the world. Tell us you showed up. Now, the part the loudest corners of the internet keep skipping. Because for all the noise about the streamer, the bond, the silence, the irony, there is a man at the actual center of this case who never asked to be in anyone's content. And he is the reason none of this is a game. Joshua Fox went to that courthouse for a child support hearing. He left it shot in the torso and the arm, with internal bleeding a paramedic could read in his falling blood pressure, with doctors who did not expect him to live through it. He is a disabled veteran. He is the father of 3 children. And while he fought to recover, it was his mother, Carolyn Smith, who spoke for the family. And what she chose to say is the second sentence this entire story is built on. She did not call for blood, with death threats reportedly flying in every direction. At the judges, at both attorneys, at her own son, at her own family, and at Etherly and his family too. Smith asked, publicly, for all of it to stop. She urged people to stop the threats against everyone, across the board. She said there was no need to threaten Etherly or his family. She asked the community, in the middle of a spectacle screaming for a villain, to keep harmony among all of us. And then she drew the line that every loud corner of this story had blurred. This was never, she said, about silencing anyone's freedom of speech. It was about something far simpler and far older. You don't have the freedom to be violent. Sit with that one too, because it does what the gag order, the bond cap, and the body armor never could. It puts the case back on its feet. Strip away the username, the crowdfunding, the curfew, the irony about a muted streamer, and what remains is a mother explaining, with more grace than the moment deserved, that speech was never the thing on trial here. Conduct was. So where does it all actually stand? As of June 2026, Dalton Etherly is 28 years old. He sits in a Montgomery County jail under $1 million bond engineered to be nearly impossible to post. He faces attempted murder and a stack of related felonies that could cost him decades of his life if he is convicted. He is bound over to a grand jury, and he is under a court order that forbids the most online man in the room from telling his own story. And here is what has to be said plainly, the way the record demands. He has been charged. He has not been convicted. He has claimed self-defense. Under the law, he is presumed innocent of every count until a jury says otherwise, and that presumption is the floor this whole thing stands on. Not a formality to be waved past on the way to a verdict the internet has already reached. It is worth stating, too, that the arrest affidavit does not say Joshua Fox was armed, and that no criminal charges against Fox have been made public. Whatever the surveillance footage shows, whatever the missing mace and the Istanbul ticket come to mean, those questions belong to a courtroom, not to a comment section, and not to this narration. 2 stories now run side by side, and they will keep running until this reaches trial. In one, a man who built an empire on the sound of his own voice has been ordered into the single silence he was never built to withstand, waiting, muted, to learn whether the evidence against him hardens into a verdict that takes the rest of his life. In the other, quieter story, a disabled veteran and father of 3 is trying to recover from wounds that nearly killed him, while his mother stands between a screaming internet and her son and asks, simply, for it to stop. When the grand jury moves, when the next ruling drops, when this finally reaches the courtroom where the gag order lifts and the performer is allowed, at last, to speak again, That is where the coverage will be, and you will hear it here first. Which brings us back to the question we started with. The one almost nobody covering this case has stopped to ask. For a man like Dalton Etherly, which is the real cage? The cell he is sitting in tonight, or the silence they imposed on a man who only ever knew how to be loud? Maybe that question answers itself the moment you understand who he made himself into. Maybe it doesn't, but it is worth carrying with you. Because the cases that are hardest to sit with are almost always the ones most worth understanding. If this story reached you the way these stories are meant to, if it made you stop and actually think, instead of just react, share it with someone who needs to see past the headline. Subscribe to Crime and Order. Hit that like button and stay close. Because this one is not finished. It is still being written. One ruling at a time. One silence at a time.